So welcome to the New Levels Coaching Podcast, Brad. Super excited to have you on. And we were just talking off air there that this all comes from, I guess, a book recommendation from my wife or a book present that she bought me for Christmas. And then lo and behold, I have the author of the book on the New Levels Coaching Podcast. So a very, very warm welcome to you, firstly.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it, and thanks to your wife as well for gifting you the book.
Yeah, it was one of my smaller presents, but it was the present I probably enjoyed the most. I probably shouldn't say that, should
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I will let
I?
her know. Yeah, hopefully she doesn't listen.
So, for those of you, well, tuning in, you will be aware from the introduction that Brad is the author of the Norwegian Method, which has become a very, very popular method within certainly the running world. But a lot of the book was focused around triathlon, which really caught my attention because my sister-in-law, actually, Brad, she's the head of triathlon coaching within our company. So we have a lot of triathletes and a lot of runners. But interestingly, when I guess I remember a little bit that triathlon breakthrough, we were in Lausanne one year watching the triathlon final, and I just
Hmm.
remember this Norwegian running away at the front and seeing Christian Blumenfeld really kind of taking a charge, and I guess that attracted me to the book and got me into it. But I'm intrigued to find out a little bit more about you before we actually go into the book. So I always start by asking Brad a little bit of an inspirational question. And yeah, for you, I guess you could pick one of two topics. Who inspired you to either get into writing, because I'm fascinated by that, or who inspired you to get into sport? You can actually give two answers here.
Yeah, it's a little bit the same. I grew up as a swimmer, started swimming at a really really young age, and probably at around five, was competing at around five and loved it, and had an awesome swim coach who started coaching me at age five. His name was Dave Perry, and he was probably the one who motivated me the most. Was just maybe not the greatest coach of technique and swimming itself, but just an incredible motivator and would bring himself to tears on the pool deck before a training session, telling you about some, the importance of it or training, or just, talk about very high level aspects of life and training and not so much the nuance of swimming, and would just get you really amped up to swim. And so I love that. I always thought that, as a kid, I felt like I was swimming for something more, and just it was bigger than just learning how to move through the water really well. So I love that. I love that. I feel like he taught me, to blend sport and life and what it can teach you about life. And yeah, it motivated the hell out of me. Yeah, I started, the writing thing came probably as I was like 12 or 13. I was a big basketball fan because I grew up in Chicago, and Michael Jordan was a huge part of my early childhood. Around the same time I started swimming. But I became a fan of Allen Iverson, who some of your listeners may not know. He was an NBA MVP, a very, very small guy, shorter guy like me, who probably shouldn't have been playing in the NBA, but was a brilliant player, and also had a rap career on the side. He was
Wow.
sang some violent gangster rap that a lot of people had a problem with this was like the mid 90s, late 90s. And so I wrote an op-ed into the Chicago Tribune. Their reporter Sam Smith, who covered Michael Jordan's entire career, he wrote this really negative story about how Allen Iverson wasn't a role model like Michael Jordan was because of all this gangster rap stuff. And I just had a problem with it because I idolized Allen Iverson and hip hop music. And as a 12-year-old, I think it was, just wrote probably a 400-word response, and they published it the next day or a couple days later because I actually had to mail it in back then, in the Tribune. And yeah, I just remember then, like, my mom and my grandma just being like, "Oh, you should do this. You should pursue this. You should write about sports." And that was probably the first time that kind of stuck with me. Like, okay, I guess I'll. This first time worked out. I wrote one thing about sports. They published it in the Chicago Tribune, so it must be that easy. I'll just keep doing it, and that just sort of stuck with me. So yeah, those two little bits from early childhood were certainly very inspirational, and yeah, have carried on with me to this day.
I love that. I love the first example, especially because I think every coach carries qualities, different qualities, whether it's scientific,
Mhm.
psychological, whether it is just a motivator. But it's really interesting to see what inspires different athletes in different ways. And as you quite rightly said, just that motivation to get you in the pool. And you remember it to this day. I think it's a really important part because we always say coaching can change people's lives and it certainly can stick with people as well. So it's a really good example. Yeah,
Yeah, and shining with what you're good at, and I think that that coach, as an example, found assistant coaches who were good with the stuff he wasn't good at, and that's what every great coach does. And he just took care of the other stuff, the motivation and the psychology. So yeah, coaching is, as you know, it's very very nuanced, and the great ones they know what they're good at and what they're not good at. So that's part of the art.
fantastic. Yeah, really good. And I guess giving our audience a bit more insight into yourself, you've kind of touched on a little bit of your swimming background, but we could go all the way back to those younger days and all the way up to present. I just want to
Sure.
give them a bit of a feel for who you are and what sports you got involved with, and then what eventually led you to writing the book that obviously I picked up at Christmas.
Yeah, like I said, started off swimming really young, and that was kind of my entire life from age 5 to 19 is when I did my first Ironman. So relatively young for triathlon. But I went to swam through high school, played water polo, went to college with the intention of swimming all 4 years. Made it not even 2 years. Before I realized that college swimming just wasn't a lot of fun, and I was missing out on various other aspects of collegiate life. So and I'd done one triathlon like between high school and college, and had watched the Ironman World Championship coverage that NBC had done in Kona, while I was still swimming, and it just that struck with me. It was just like 03, 04. They had really, really good coverage that year. It was an awesome race, and I was just like, I have to do this. I have to do Ironman. So yeah, I signed up for my first Ironman at 19. I did it. It was a couple of weeks after my 19th birthday in Ironman, Wisconsin. And yeah, caught the bug like so many people did. Stopped swimming, did triathlon full time for the last couple of years in college. And yeah, it was probably as you probably have seen a lot of younger athletes who get way too overzealous at the start. Kind of had no clue what I was doing. I was mostly self-coached. I knew what I was doing from swimming. I kind of brought on this guy who was on the cycling club who knew a lot about cycling, and then I had a buddy who was on the cross country team. So I was just trying to figure out my own way of doing this, and ultimately just overtraining for years and years, while trying to pursue all these Ironman goals and trying to qualify for Kona. And yes, most of my 20s doing long distance triathlon. I've spent most of my 30s kind of recovering from that and finding new pursuits. Did a bit of cyclocross for a few years and got really into that. And yeah, lately it's at least the goal now going forward is all swim run. I've got two small kids, so I found that I can still get in the swim run training that I need if I remove cycling. It actually makes it possible to still pursue some goals while not just taking up too much of my time. So yeah, that's kind of, I just describe myself as an endurance junkie now, and when I hear about a really cool event, I'm just like, I should spend a year or two trying to do that. So yeah, now it's all my buddy and I are obsessed with the Otillo in Sweden. So we're like, how do we get there? And yeah, that's where we are now.
Amazing. And how old are the little ones now, Brad? Are they grown up?
Almost 5 and almost 3. So
Wow.
yeah, it's a very high intensity age, is I would describe it. A lot of physical energy required.
But getting the sleep back, you're finding your
Yeah,
sleep
yeah,
back again.
yeah. That's I've always been pretty good about that. Like I'm just I'm an early, so yeah. The newborn stuff is tough, but yeah, I go to sleep when the kids go to sleep, and I'm up before anyone. So yeah, sleep is back to normal. That's good.
So very much like you say, throwing yourself in a lot of endurance sports and that longer distance stuff at quite a relatively young age as well for like you
Mhm.
said the Ironman scene in particular. And was that the kind of interest that sparked the interest in the kind of Norwegian method? And for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with that method, I guess from your perspective, what did you see when you were discovering the Norwegian method, or how did you hear about it, and what led you to start that? Not necessarily a fascination, but certainly led you to the book eventually to start giving people more of an insight into this very popular method that is very much coming to the forefront, especially here in the UK.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by different training ideologies. I kind of left out when I was talking about my own athletic pursuits, my professional pursuits at that same time. At age 20, I started interning for Triathlete magazine. Started working for them at 21, and became editor a couple of years later. And the cool part of that was just this access and this experience to all these really great coaches and athletes. From the early days of triathlon or from that current time, who were really just feeding me information and teaching me about training methods. When I started, I was editing articles for both Mark Allen and Simon Lessing, at the same time. So I'm just, and like I said, I knew nothing about training. I was just coming into it being like, just throwing darts at the wall, being like, how do I get through 140.6 miles? And so I was learning really fast and learning very, very different approaches, and finding out that different things work for different bodies. And, I think that I came into it with the swimmer's approach of like, this is what works, this is what doesn't, you have to do it one way. And quickly find out that endurance was very, very different. And yeah, so that sparked my interest in just different methodologies and figuring out what works for different groups or different individuals. And I honestly don't know the first time I heard about the Norwegian method. It was I probably when I first heard about it, I probably reflected on it the same way a lot of Norwegians do, which is like, haha, like that's not a real thing. Like it's just this like fairy tale that people make up. And even it wasn't until it was just after COVID that Red Bull had contracted me to do a feature story on Christian. And that's when I initially gone over to Norway to work on that. And the focus of that article was really more on Christian himself and not so much on the science. And that was on purpose. Red Bull had said his training methods had been written about a lot, and people had talked about double threshold and lactate, and that was known about. So we really tried to leave that kind of out of the feature. And then after I had done that, I stayed in touch with Christian and especially Olaf, his coach. And really, Olaf is such an interesting mind, and that sort of just again sparked my interest into training methodologies. And I realized he was doing something different, so I just started kind of just pinging him all the time, asking various things of like, what are you doing here? What aren't you doing here? Why is this right? Why is this wrong? And just trying to get his thoughts. And about the same time I'm doing that, a book publisher had reached out who had read the article on Christian and, had seen the Norwegian method in the news and being sort of hyped up, and asked if I thought there would be if there was enough there to build a whole book out. The timing just really worked. I sort of had all this information from Christian and Olaf that I had been thinking about. I had been following Jakob Ingebrigtsen's career very closely. And you asked at the beginning of people who kind of motivate you the most. The last few years, it's really been, as I've gotten more into running, it's just been Jakob is such a magnetic figure and just someone that I've become so interested in following, and someone who motivates the hell out of me. Just that combination of things, I was just like, between that right group of athletes and if I first contacted Olaf and said, hey, I think I want to do a book on this, can I bother you for, an hour or two a week for, months on end? And, he was very, very gracious with his time. He said, sure. And that was kind of what I needed to believe that, we had enough in here for a book. And, about a year later, that's kind of what we came up with.
Wow, so it was pretty quick then for getting out there. I know people who I've spoken to before who've written books. It's like, 6 years down the line, we finally got it out there.
No, I would have, and honestly, like I feel like I would love to have another 6 months or so to work on it. And just with the timing that we decided to start, and we also had a distribution agreement in place with another publisher that was really important. So that also kind of helped. We had a really tight deadline, and we were also trying to squeeze in the Olympics kind of at the last minute because that was so crucial to the sort of success of the method. As you see, if Jakob has a good race, then it's Norwegian method is the greatest thing in the world. If Christian has a bad race, it's totally broken. It ebbs and flows like that. But we really wanted to capitalize on the Olympics and include that in there. A pretty tight time frame as far as books go, but also coming from the editorial side and the magazine side, it was also what I was used to and kind of enjoy.
Nice. So, like you say, very gracious with the time as well, and getting everything together, and obviously having an understanding of the sport massively helps. You touched on Jakob there, and I guess I'll go to him first because he really has brought it to life within the running circle here in the UK. I
Hmm.
know a lot of the book was focused around triathlon, but it did mention particularly the Ingebrigtsen brothers. And, although the two brothers had success, it wasn't really catapulted into the spotlight here in the UK until Jakob started having that success. And
Yeah.
more people were seemingly then looking into this method. But I'm conscious a lot of our audience might be sat here thinking, well, what's a Norwegian method? And my first line to them would be go and get the book because it is brilliant. I generally recommend it. And actually, I've handed it out already to one of our other coaches for them to have a read. And we have a coach's library now in our office. And yeah,
Nice.
that's a popular choice already, which is great.
Love it.
But there will be people sat here thinking, well, what's this Norwegian method? And as a coach, I used to call it the Jakob method because everyone just associated it with Jakob. But
Yeah.
it's more from the book, it's more of a cultural thing, isn't it? But it has been adapted a lot. And I guess, what was your initial take on it, Brad, when you first kind of learnt the method? And did that kind of change over time what your view of the method was?
Yeah, I think that when I first heard about it, I just focused on those two really key elements that everyone talks about, and that's double threshold and lactate testing, which are definitely I don't want to say vital, but somewhat crucial to the method, and they also were kind of the first two components that really differentiated it from other pyramidal or linear training or all the other types of training before it that as a whole they're all so similar and so intertwined, but those are the two that really stick out as all right, these are doing something different. And I think some people looked at those as being a bit of a magic pill, and I think lactate can be for certain people when it's used right. It can be very, very valuable for people like coaches like you, as you're working with an athlete to kind of learn about their bodies and what's working. But yeah, certainly not something that's absolutely necessary. But I would say, yeah, when people ask me what it is, I say very, very high volume. That is, definitely a crucial part of the method. Relatively low intensity, and that's just relative to other training methodologies that you might be familiar with. And yeah, ideally those high intensity sessions, those threshold sessions, are guided by lactate or otherwise controlled very specifically, so as not to jeopardize kind of the golden goose of the method, which is maximizing your volume, and the idea that over the longest time period, for the most part, the athletes who are doing the most volume and managing that intensity the best are ultimately going to have the best results. And obviously there are it doesn't work for everyone. I think one of the coolest things I learned when I started researching this, and I write a bit about Dr. Steven Seiler, who's an honorary Norwegian. He's an American who's lived in Norway forever and one of the most brilliant sports researchers in the world. And if any of your audience is not following him on social media, you absolutely need to. But his daughter was a brilliant runner, still is, and has moved on from elite running. But she was one of the first people I talked to for the book, and just trying to get a Norwegian perspective on what the Norwegian method is. And she was just like, it doesn't work for me at all. Like, it ruined my running for a year. She was just like, it was absolutely, and just what worked for her was it kind of totally flipped, very, very low volume, very high intensity. And so it's certainly not like this is the only thing that's going on in Norway. It's not like 1960s USSR where they're weightlifting, where like this is the program. And that's what really got me to the understanding that what really differentiates the method is the cultural aspects that make the upbringing different, and the relationship to sport, and specifically endurance sport, a bit different. And I think that is something that might be a bit uniquely Norwegian, is just the way that they endurance exists in the culture. It's such a prominent part, and that's why I love to look at the Norwegian method. But Dr. Seiler was the one who conceptualized this, but really it's a pyramid. And at the bottom are all the cultural aspects that make building these athletes possible. And the aspects as we get to the top are a bit smaller: double threshold and volume and all this, and then the little altitude, heat training, these tiny things that I touch on in the book. But really, the basis of it is the life and the culture in Norway, for sure.
It's a really, really good point. I think I'm glad you've highlighted it around it doesn't work for everybody, which we know about all training methods, right? They've got to be right for the individual. They've even got to be right for the event, which you kind of touch upon in the book as well. Like it's
Mhm.
not that this method might be right for every single event either. And I think we might see limitations, particularly with Jakob and say the 1500 meters,
Yeah.
where there's people who have very different training models and approaches who have a little bit more tools in their locker. I would describe it
Hmm.
as. But if it's run in a certain way, he's always going to be there. And there's that element to it. But I went out to train in E10 in Kenya, and I got back, and a lot of the questions came. Oh, should we be training like the Kenyans? And the first thing I said was, look, this is a cultural thing. We can't match that culture. They've been doing this since they were 4, 5, 6,
Yep.
and even the barefoot running craze. Oh, they run bare feet in Kenya. It's not really a choice that they run bare feet. It's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
And as a result, their feet are stronger, and then people are trying to run barefooted over here in the UK, and we're just not culturally designed that way.
Yeah. That
Um,
was an interesting craze for that, the 10 years that lasted.
Yeah, and it did last as well, and it got a
Yeah.
lot of traction as well. But it shows that people are looking almost for, I call it like that magic bullet. They
Mhm.
they are looking for that quick fix. But I'm really glad you've highlighted that even in Norway, it's not just a thing that everybody does. Even though they're in Norway, they're still training different methods out there, and different methods exist. And you highlighted Peter Coe in the book,
Mhm.
which was interesting. And I guess obviously want to get this right from your perspective as well. How we look at it here in the UK is we have the polarized approach to training, which is very much, a lot done at low intensity, around sort of 80% maybe, and then 20% of it's done at that kind of a higher intensity, or maybe just slightly less than that. And there's a little bit in the middle there. So maybe 15% at higher intensity, and then maybe 5 in the middle. And then there's the what we call the pyramidal now, which is what people are going to, which is very much the kind of Norwegian approach, where there's loads stacked in that middle section, which is
Mhm.
pretty much zone 2 if we look at a 3 zone model, where there's loads in and around LT1 and LT2, the lactic term points, and it's closely monitored. Um, is that how you would kind of describe that approach, where it's a bit more stacked in the middle for particularly that Norwegian method?
Yeah, and I think that's why I mentioned a couple times that the 3 zone system works so well for the Norwegian method. Like if someone wants to go all in on Norwegian lactate guided training, I would say just do what Marius did. And for a runner, this would be different if you were like an
Mm.
elite short course triathlete or something that had some specifics you were training for. But for a distance runner, yeah, I would say just simplify it. 3 zones work. Yeah, that zone 2, just threshold, sub threshold, sub LT2 is kind of the sweet spot, as Marius called it, which is, for him, it's 3.0 millimoles of lactate. And yeah, very, very different from individuals, as anyone who's played with lactate knows. Um, but yeah, that would be the biggest difference, is just the more control at the higher ends, and almost not eschewing the absolute highest ends of training, but I mean that is like we're talking 1%, whereas like in the polarized, that 20% of high intensity would be distributed pretty well across there. There might be some really, really high intensity, there might be something closer to 80, but the in the truest sense, in Marius's conception of the Norwegian method, if you will, that absolute, there's no need for 5 zones because he's not spending any time up in zone 5. That's at the end of the 5K race day is the only time he would see that. But that's a very, very disciplined approach to it, and then you can kind of step back from there and kind of make it your own, and build out what you need.
And it goes against a lot of as coaches we get the question, and we hear this a lot. It's been a question that's always thrown at coaches, and you hear it regularly from audiences of in order to run at a given speed you need to train at a given speed, if not
Mhm.
faster. And I'll be honest, I'm not a huge believer in it. I believe that you've got to run fast at certain times, and you have to have the mechanics that are going to carry you to certain speeds, absolutely. But often as a coach, what I tend to see is people who train at a lesser speed are able to actually increase their speed on race day.
Yeah.
And people who hit higher speeds in training often can't live up to that in races. It's almost like they're leaving something behind in training and they can't match it in races. But the Norwegian method does really go against that, doesn't it? There isn't much of that real high intensity, faster than race pace work within the program. I
Yeah.
guess, again, a question more for the audience than myself here to help give them that education side of it. So why does it work? How does the science work if they're not running really at race pace in training? Why are then they able to do that in races and perform at a much higher intensity within that race setting?
Similar, somewhat to what you would, because you mentioned Eton in Kenya, similar to the Kenyan system of so much of this very very low intensity training is building all your capillaries. It's building your mitochondria. It's making you a whole lot stronger, even though it might not. While you're doing it, it probably doesn't feel that way. And then you can have all those same effects that you would have at slightly higher intensities without the costs spilling over to the next day. And then you're shifting to this kind of training where, which a lot of people do, where it's like on off. It's hard day, easy day, hard day, easy day, which has been the way that people, especially people who really, in the Peter Co method, where you have a lot of very very high intensity training. You also have a lot of very very, what we would call recovery days. And in the truest sense of the Norwegian method, you don't use the term recovery day because you don't really need one. You're never spilling over that threshold where you're causing too much cost, and whether that's to the muscles themselves, whether that's to the endocrine system, whether it's to other hormones, just the system as a whole. You've got to learn kind of where that tipping point is. And if there is any magic to the Norwegian method, it is controlling yourself from getting over that tipping point, so that the next day, the rest of the week, the rest of the training block, the month, the year, it just continues uninterrupted. And I think if you look at the two most successful Norwegian athletes, Christian and Jakob, obviously there's a lot of similarities into some of the minutia of their training, but part of the reason they've been so extraordinarily successful is that it's just been this the entire time, just the slow, steady. There haven't been a lot of injuries. I know Jakob had his Achilles last winter. But Christian, especially, like, he had a stress fracture when he was a teenager, and like literally has not been injured outside of that, which I think is another phenomenal tribute to the method in a sport where the guys at his level, maybe aside from an Alex Yee in the UK, like everyone at the Olympic distance, elite level triathlon is getting hurt a lot because you're training so intensely for three different sports, and there's so much mechanical cost. But yeah, he's been able to maintain an injury-free life for 12 years, and that's really because one injury can deter a whole season, and then that just throws everything off, as you know, and that's definitely a big component of the method as well.
And I guess that is kind of if not the crucial component, is that consistency over time. It's almost like the tortoise against the hare, isn't it? It's like, is that the right terminology I'm using there? Where if you're slow and steady and you're just constantly grinding away, you're putting blocks on top of blocks on top of blocks, as opposed to somebody like I use, I guess, an Alistair Brownlee as an example. Would come and would be always managing another niggle or another injury, and it seems like eventually it caught up with Alistair, but he did have these great moments in the sport. But compare that to a Christian or even a Javier Gomez from Spain, who seem to have a bit more consistency, and they seem to have that longevity. And maybe that is why, I don't know, I'm just hypothesizing, maybe that is why Alistair did struggle at the longer distances too, because he wasn't able to build that background.
Yeah, definitely. I know. Use the tortoise and the hare example because, like, I feel like the tortoise is the perfect example for Christian. People look at him and be like, that one, he shouldn't be an Olympic champion. Two, he should not be winning Ironman races at that. When I started racing Ironman, there was such a focus on, like, weight was everything, and it was this was when Lance is winning Tour de France and talking about power to weight ratio, and everyone just wants to focus on that, and there was such a focus on leanness and at the time that Alistair was starting to race as well and having a lot of success. But yeah, I think that there's you're starting to see a little bit of a shift in triathlon and in running as well, and a focus more on energy and strength, and not strength being muscle, but strength being its own thing and a key component of endurance. yeah, it's the athletes who can really master that integrating strength into endurance are the ones who can just have that success and at multiple different distances. Which again, when I started out in triathlon, the idea of winning an Olympic gold and an Ironman in the same year just it wouldn't have even crossed my mind because it was absolutely impossible. And that's what turned Christian on about it. And to him, it was so possible. He knew he was going to do it. And yeah, I think that's why I was so turned on by writing about him. Because I remember when he announced that he was going to try to do that, I was the first person to tweet. I could go back and find it. I'm sure it was years and years ago, but I tweeted like you just can't do that. Like it was something. Just I took a shot at Christian, and I remember he said he's like, oh yeah, I saw it. He sees everything that's written about him on social media,
Wow.
and is just so motivated by that those negative stuff, or when people call him chubby or whatever they say about him. But yeah, it's that doing that impossible that motivates him and has certainly motivated me. And yeah, if any of your listeners, they don't think that they have an endurance body or something, or they think, I'm not, I've got too much mass for this or something. That's just seems like such an archaic way of looking at endurance. And yeah, should definitely switch the way that they view that.
It's a really, really good point. And yeah, I think, I do a lot more ultra trail coaching these days. And there's been some big voices in the sport, which is good, particularly on the women's side, who've been speaking up about being proud of their body type. And,
Mhm.
they're stronger as a
Yeah.
result of that. And maybe when they were younger, they got dragged into that. I guess that same narrative, lighter is better, which is not
Mhm.
always the case. And back to that point about consistency, if you are treading a fine line with energy and that relative energy, then the injuries are more likely to happen. And if you do take a season out because of injury, then what is the cost of that? Not just on performance, but long term health as well, which is crucial to performance. So it's like a double sided coin. So I'm really glad you brought that up about that strength element, and also how people look. Everybody looks different. Everybody's training is different, and that's the beauty of sport, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and this in endurance, it's such a great equalizer. And yeah,
Mm.
you can see so many different body types. I'm glad you brought up the ultra because yeah, I think you're really seeing like a seismic shift there. And I feel like so much because the ultra community is such an outlier and they're trying such extreme things. Like there's so much trickle down from ultra to other endurance because what they're trying to do is so absurdly impossible. And they're like just trying to figure out how to actually make it work. And so yeah, I'm fascinated by like, especially with David Roach and all his experiments, what he's doing. I'm like so glued into that because I think there's so much application for even novice marathoners and yeah, everyday runners.
Yeah, I mean, David obviously is going after that Western States record. He's quite open about it. It's a great YouTube series out
Yeah,
actually
it's
if people
awesome.
haven't tuned in. And yeah, he had some real big success last year, particularly at Javelin 100, Leadville, and yeah, almost like calls himself his own science project, doesn't he? And he's trying high carb strategies and heat strategies and all different types of things. So if you're not tuned into that, then I suggest having a look at YouTube. And him and Megan have a great podcast as well, so you can tune into that. And they're very open about the training, which is
Yeah,
great. And I guess that was one thing about the book that intrigued me, Brad, was they did seem to be very open about what they were willing to share. It was almost like we don't have any secrets.
yeah.
It's just out there for the public to see.
Yeah, and that's the way yeah, Olaf and Christian and Gustav, that little triumvirate has always been. They're not trying to they're very much experimenting as well and want to be open about what they're doing and they're at this point they feel like they've gotten all what Olaf would call the low hanging fruit. So now they're looking for more bits and pieces, and I think that's why so much of the focus now is on heat and sort of how that can be used and interplayed with altitude to really maximize training. Um, but yeah, it's really the only time I remember it was like a couple, we were getting really close to the Olympics and I was just trying to finish up the heat chapter and like I was asking Ola some really specific questions and he's like, that touches on something where he's like, we're tinkering with specifically for Paris. He's like, I'm not ready to share that yet. And I was like, all right, cool. I'm glad that like there's actually some stuff that yeah, they want to like see if it works first before they share it with the world. Which yeah, I think that they always want to be. So there's definitely a bit that they want to be one step ahead, but
Mm.
Yeah, just their personalities and yeah, Olaf in general. Like he's an engineer and not a scientist per se, but he considers himself a sports scientist and that he wants to absorb and share everything he can. And that's a very Norwegian thing as well. Like as I write about with Olympia Toppin and the way that older their sports organizations are intermingled. It's really easy if a track coach wants to go spend some time with a cycling coach or cross country skiing or this or that. There's just a lot of intermingling between the coaches, and as you know, that just lifts everyone up and makes everyone better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We were in a shared learning session on Monday with a physiologist here in Loughborough, and there was triathlon coaches, running coaches, sprint coaches, and we were all chatting about durability. And the physiologists were giving their perspective, the coaches were giving their perspective, and came away from the session buzzing, thinking that was a really good session. A lot of shared learning going on. I think it does lift the standards, and I think particularly here in the UK, maybe people have had their barriers up over in the past, but now people are a little bit more open to sharing, and I think they've realised that everybody's just then helping each other, and that will only lift the standard, which in turn will help their athletes, because if you lift the standard in one area, often people have to follow, or you get left behind. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
good to hear that culture starting to transition over. With the method in particular, you mentioned the double threshold, and I'm intrigued to get your perspective on this, Brad, because one question that we get a lot as coaches is from let's call the rather than elite athletes, the amateur athletes. I'm talking about the general mass audience, and I'll use a marathon runner as an example. Somebody who's going to stand on the start line, and maybe look at finishing the marathon in around sort of 4 to 5 hours, and they'll have seen this method online, and they'll have seen the hype around it, and we'll maybe get a question thrown at us around, should I add double threshold training into my training? And my general response is like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because you're probably not doing enough volume to start off with, and you're probably not doing enough easy running volume. And I think the biggest problem I have with it over here in the UK is people are trying to put it in or emulate it without really understanding it, and that is what is going to get them problems. So they're just adding more intensity to a
Yeah.
program that probably isn't a low enough intensity to start off with.
Yeah, a lot of people they'll hear double threshold, be like, "Oh, 2 hard days or 2 hard sessions on the same day. Like that must be really hard." And then I get just this super boost of fitness, and that's not the idea behind doing it at all. It's really just a smarter way of blocking your high intensity training so that you could maximize the recovery periods and the days that you're not doing those high intensity days. And I think that yeah, what people, if you bring up someone like 4 to 5 hour marathoner, yeah, I would say the first person who should start thinking about like a double threshold, and we'll say for guys, if you're running 50 miles a week and have like 310 or unders, like Boston kind of goals, are like the kind of people who might want to start thinking about that. So I would, if you're not up around 50 miles a week, yeah, your volume's not high enough that you should be focusing on other things first. You should just focus on the number of days that you're running and the amount of volume and what the intensity distribution looks like within those days. But yeah, there's really not a need for to be doubling and certainly to be doing a hard double day. And with that said, people hear threshold, and like I know this has become like the most yeah, misused and misunderstood term. But yeah, threshold training sounds hard, but it's also, as far as the Norwegian method is concerned, it's controlled. It is right around LT2. It's not super high intensity. So that when it's done right, it can just be a very good a day of a lot of high volume of threshold training, and that's what you're looking for, is 1 or 2 of those days a week, a lot of volume at threshold, which is hard, but it's not, you're not, as we talked about before, putting all this cost on your body, on the entire system, so that the next day is just laying on the couch in the sauna, just totally recovering. But yeah, for most people, majority of people listening, I probably don't need to worry about it. But I think that those runners who are at a a higher end amateur athlete who might have hit a plateau and have been running for a while and are kind of just looking for something, one, to just maybe a physiological boost, or two, just a psychological boost. Like, this would be a fun way to train, a fun way to restructure my week. It can really be of benefit for them.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Like looking for that variety, looking for a change, and that novel stimulus often gives people a boost in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Trying something new in training. I guess the other thing that a lot of people don't consider is that people who implement this in Norway, and we're talking about full-time athletes who go home, rest, recover during the day to then go again. And our lifestyles here again, it comes back to that cultural thing, doesn't it? It's like you're getting up really early in the morning, you're then having to recover, go to work, you then come back quite late at night, you're going to do another double, you're going to do a double session day. Like, is that really the best method if you're working sort of 40
Yeah.
hours a week? It's a
Yeah. Yeah.
tricky one.
Right. You don't want to be sitting at a desk all day between your two threshold sessions, and that would be way too costly on the body and cause all kinds of problems. And yeah, I think something I try to mention a few times throughout the book, especially at the beginning and the end, is that you cannot mimic the lifestyles of a Jakob or a Christian. And
Mm.
I've only had insights into Christian's lifestyle, but it's very very stoic. It's very it is, when he's not training, he is as turned off as he can be. From everything I've read and seen about Jakob, he's been with his show. The times that he's not training, it is all about how much of his brain and body he can turn off, and he just wants dumb TV and dumb things to fill his brain. I'm sure it's changed now. He's become a father at a relatively young age. He's like 23 when his daughter was born, so I'm sure life changed a little bit. But yeah, very and the best athletes, regardless of what country they're from or what sport they're doing, that having that on and off switch and being able to do that at an elite level is so important. And it's so cool to see when you see a really, really high performing athlete just absolutely in the zone and then absolutely turned off and
Mm.
rested and relaxed, minutes later. I really, really wish I could master that.
It's a real skill, isn't it? That ability to go and step into that arena and turn everything on, but
Mm-hmm.
then be super relaxed outside of that. Yeah, I think it's what separates the best from just the secondary best. And come back to that cultural point. I had the pleasure of listening to an athlete from Kenya called Mary Ngugi, who she's coached by Steve Cram over here in the UK, but she's from Kenya. She spends a lot of time here in the UK, but when she goes back to Kenya, she was describing to the audience how, I guess, almost like military like her day is. It's like get up at 5, go for a run, come back, eat, sleep, maybe go and do a bit of conditioning at the gym, come back, eat, sleep, go out for your second run of the day, come back, and in bed for like 7, 8 o'clock at night after they've eaten again, and sleep 10, 12 hours a day
Yeah.
around their training. And getting back to that point about originally we had a bit of a surge in the Kenyan training. How do Kenyans approach it? And people not considering at all that they may approach it like this for their training. They are training hard, but they are recovering twice as hard, and
Yeah.
everything is stemmed around that recovery.
Yeah. Since you brought her up, the one time I've seen like a truly, truly elite runner, like up and like watched their lifestyle, Ben True, who's married to Sarah True, the great U.S.
Mm.
triathlete. He is, one of the best U.S. runners. I was doing a story on her. They were training in Athens, Georgia, ahead of one of the Olympics. It must have been 2020, maybe 2016, and so I, was hanging around Sarah and just seeing Ben's there in full on training mode. And he is a very, very high volume runner, and I think at the time he was doing like 120 miles a week. And he was up in the morning doing like a almost like 18 or 20 miles on gravel road and would be gone for a couple hours. Would come home, would sleep for a couple hours, would get up and there might be like a strength training or some kind of like core or something else. Would eat lunch, lay on the couch, and maybe sleep again. Then would get up and do his track session, which I watched. To me, it was insanely intense. Would go home, eat, and then go to bed at like 7 o'clock and sleep for 14 hours. And I remember asking Sarah, I was like, "Is this?" She's like, "No, this is the way he always is every day, his entire life. This is who he is. He probably sleeps like 15, 16 hours a day. He trains
Wow.
insanely hard, and it's just repeating every." And I was just like, "Wow, that is." and I was still like somewhat new to triathlon and not really, still not much of a runner, but that was the first time I'd seen someone who, one, could run 120 miles a week, and two, just what it took outside of the 120 miles, what your life has to look like to be able to sustain that at that kind of intensity. So yeah, don't try to mimic some of these. If you see what they're doing on Strava, don't try to layer that on top of your own life if you have a real life.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's often we look for all the best bits and we don't realize all the boring bits that they are not doing or doing, and
Yes.
yeah, they don't put that in. I think Ben True has got himself into trail and ultra coaching, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah,
Yeah.
I thought I heard that. Yeah, that was kind of the
Mm.
next step, which yeah, it seems right up his alley. And yeah, it was yeah. From I just remember talking to and not a very talkative guy, like very very stoic and very very quiet. At least when I was around him, but yeah, I was just peppering him with all these questions, like, how the hell do you run this much? Like, it is insane. And yeah, it was a lot of those first runs in the day were a lot of really really easy on gravel, crushed gravel roads, just long and upper zone one, lower zone two, just mindless running, and a whole lot of that is really the crux of the training.
And that was interesting because the podcast I was listening to who mentioned Ben, she was saying she'd moved to him as a coach and how he'd adapted her training to give her more easier days between the sessions and spread the volume out a little bit more and got her doing more volume but at a bit of a lower intensity, and that had a real impact on her training and she was getting some really good results from that. But also Ben's name came up at that same camp where Mary was speaking. A good friend of mine, Chris Thompson, a marathon runner here in the UK, just recently retired. He got asked a question as to, who was the best trainer you ever trained with, and he named Ben True.
Nice.
And yeah, he out of everybody he trained with in his entire career, he felt like he kind of didn't have the better of, but he kind of had the measure of, and he could match them. And if they were training together, he could certainly hold his own. He said, but Ben True, he said, was just an animal. He says he
Yeah.
was unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched a lot of really, Olympic champions do workouts and everything, but I remember watching him do a track session at the University of Georgia, and I don't believe it was one of his harder sessions, but I've never seen a human move that fast. And I remember asking him, I'm just like, how do your feet not make any noise? Because he's just flying around the track. I'm like, I don't hear them. And he just is like, I never really thought about that. I'm just like, that's like the first thing I thought about. I'm just like, if I was running at any, like, I'm just stomping and making noise, and there were other runners on the track and you can hear them. I'm like, the guy who's running the 4 minute mile, just not making a sound. Yeah, just
Yeah.
amazing runner and really, really awesome to watch.
Yeah, but they're the best moments, aren't you? When you see somebody like that and they're in full flow and you think, wow, yeah, there's someone special.
Must be
Um,
nice.
I'm interested in you talking a lot around kind of that intensity, and I love the way that you use the word because I use it a lot. Cost, like what is the cost on the body, and I think that's a big factor that gets overlooked with any type of training, whether it's the Norwegian method, threshold, whether whatever it's classified as these days, tempo, threshold, steady. Everyone seems to have a different terminology for it. But the way I'm trying to explain it to the athletes who I work with is, yeah, them trying to think about the cost on the body, and not just on the body, but the rest of the program as well. And there's a bit of a culture here in the UK where, harder is better. The harder you go, the more bang you're going to get for your buck. And I don't believe that to be true. And actually, controlling that intensity, it all does come down to cost, doesn't it? The cost is less and you're still getting a good amount of bang for your buck, and you can move on to the next workout and potentially do more volume, which is then going to have those big adaptations, that you do want in the long term.
Yeah, there's definitely a similar mentality in the U.S. of doing one more rep, doing the extra, making it harder, making sure you're sore the following day, like especially for weightlifters. Like there's been this mentality for so long. Like if you go to the gym, lift, and those muscles aren't really really sore the next day, you didn't do it right, you didn't get a good enough quote unquote pump, and it's kind of a wasted workout. And that even for weightlifting, which people think is so different from endurance. It's really not. Yeah, there's probably way more. If you're sore the next day, you're probably inflicting too much cost, especially if you're planning on training more than a couple times a week. And Yeah, it's and that cost goes for a lot more than you can inherently feel like in the muscles. Like it's not just a little twinge in the knee. Oh, maybe I went a little too hard. My Achilles is a little sore. Maybe I that track session was a bit too tough. It's hormones. It's psychological. It affects your sleep. And Yeah, I think that there can definitely be a lot of value in maybe doing one less rep. If you're doing interval sessions on a track on a treadmill, and in all of our minds we think, oh, I should probably do, even if we've hit what our coaches prescribed. Say we're doing, I don't know, 8 times 400 at whatever your interval is, and you get to the finish the eighth one, you're like, oh, I feel great, like I killed it, I could do 9, I could do 10. There's probably, especially if you have a well-designed program and a good coach, there's a lot more value in not doing more and not applying costs to the next day. And I think about it like, you think about having a beer at night. Like it'd be really, really nice. It would feel really good. But there is a cost the following day. Think about the next day's session. And if you want to have a good session that next day, maybe having, one less interval, one less beer, is ultimately going to make that next session better. And you stack that up over weeks and weeks and months. And, that's kind of where the real gains come in. And just because you can't feel it from day to day, like, oh, that was really hard, doesn't mean that it wasn't an important session and it wasn't better for you than a possibly slightly more intense session.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And quite often, when people get to the end of the session, if they've done it correctly, a threshold type session, and they feel like they could do another 2 or 3 reps, and they've probably hit the right zone. It's like you
Yeah.
probably should. You should probably feel like you've got quite a lot more in there. And I guess that's another misconception is, they, again, you look on social media and look at Jakob doing some 3 minute intervals, for example, some 3 minute threshold reps, and people see, oh, he's ran 257 per K, and they immediately think, well, that's fast. Jakob's running his threshold days fast, but actually, relative to Jakob, that's not that
Yeah.
fast.
It's
That's like half marathon intensity.
Yep. Yeah,
And
and you see it if you watch, any of his YouTube stuff. Like it's very rare that you see him even in his threshold workouts like look strained or look stressed. Like it is so controlled, and so it's fast, like for you and me. But it is, it's not easy for him, but it's certainly just in this comfort flow zone, that is just very, very repeatable, not just within the day, but within the week and the month, and just, being able to shut it down with that knowledge that, I did what I need to do, and I'm going to feel great tomorrow because I didn't step over. I liken it to writing. If you're in a good flow of writing, like if working on this book and was in a really good place, it's like, man, I could just keep on writing for another 30 minutes or an hour. Most of the time, it's way better to stop, turn the computer off, get up the following morning, and you're still fresh and excited and motivated, instead of just burning your brain out, and not feeling fresh the next day.
that's a really good way of looking at it. And I think also you highlight a very important point as well. It's not just that physiological cost, it's not the muscular cost, it's also the psychological cost
Mhm.
of probably the last coach I worked with in the sport. I used to say he's, psychological genius. He used to just know when to pull you off, and he always seemed to get it right that you'd leave the session just feeling really good. You'd not really gone too hard. Maybe there's a time and place for that, but often that came in the races. But he'd pull you off, and you'd just be getting that point where you're just getting faster and faster. And he'd say, oh, okay, yeah, we're good, we're good. And you go away almost buzzing from the session because you felt like there was more in there. And I think it was really clever from a psychological point of view, too. You
Yeah.
wanted to come back. You felt like the next day you could get up.
Yeah, and then if you can maintain that mentality and that approach to training, and then sprinkle in some non A races, some B races, that those are your intense days, and then you'll feel so hyper motivated on those days, perform really well, and then that's extra motivation to, oh my God, this is working. It just carries over. That's definitely another key component to the elite guys who prescribe to the Norwegian method. Their success is, racing, almost always being in race shape, close to it, and racing very, very often, and to really, really fine tune that fitness. That's why you see Jakob do a full running season. He loves doing cross country because he feels like that's part of the flow of the season that keeps him healthy, keeps him motivated. Those are his, going and winning the European cross country championships is just a really, really good high intensity run for him. But yeah, so racing often is definitely, even for amateurs, it is good if you can control yourself and save those bigger efforts for a race day. And even if it's, a park run like you guys have, or like something, non-competitive, it doesn't have to be this, super huge ordeal.
Yeah, it's a really good tip. We actually did a podcast on it once about having A, B, and C goal races and putting them in your program, and how, as long as you're training through those and looking at those as training opportunities, that's a really good way to add some intensity into your plan. And I think that's what I took from the Norwegian method in particular was they use the races to get the intensity. They maybe don't taper for all those races because they can't, because they still got to get the training volume in. But then around those races, the intensity goes back to where they need it to be. So they
Mhm.
don't go to a 5K or the European cross country champs, as you said, smash that on the weekend, then go to Tuesday, which is what happens in the UK, go to club night and smash that one too. And then,
Yeah.
tempo on a Thursday and we'll go and smash that one too. And yeah, they're very controlled with it. They race hard and then they go back to that control mechanism, don't they?
Yeah, yeah. I read a bit in the chapter, one of the last chapters on peaking, just about like what Jakob's race week looks like, and it's so similar to what his normal week is, and similar to when I talk about Christian and Gustav, who got people were so amazed at this workout they did a week out from Kona, because it was such a big volume effort, and really it was just. It would have been weird for them not to do that big a volume, because if they didn't, it would have been such a colossal shift from what they've been doing for years and years. So yeah, even when you're getting closer to those A races of yeah, you want to be tapering, but it shouldn't be like this. The taper isn't this complete shut off and shift of what you've been doing for a year straight, because that's just yeah, too dramatic for the body.
Yeah, and I really like that chapter around what people were perceiving to still be a huge volume session. Well, it was not really huge volume for those guys. Like
Yeah,
they're so used to it. But also, I read again an article from Kenya years ago. Is that if you've controlled the intensity, then you haven't really done any damage either. So, it
right.
might have high volume, but again, the cost wasn't too much. And I think, yeah, there's definitely an element of people maybe taper a little bit too much and get lethargic, or people change things too much is probably the word I'm looking for. The taper looks very different to their program or what they usually do. Whereas I'm a big fan of like keeping routine, even in race week, if you generally double day, like on a Tuesday and you race on a Saturday, just do a double day, just do it a little bit less intense and maybe take a little bit of volume off there, but try and keep your routine of
Yeah.
some sort, or else the body's going to be like, whoa, what are you doing to me?
Yeah, yeah, and you see that so often of people saying, my taper feels so flat, or I was so flat on race day, and it's probably usually over resting and just a too much of a shift from people are doing very very high volume. They reduce that volume so much while keeping all the intensity, or even raising the intensity, both the amount they're doing and like, oh, I need to do. You ever go to Kona, you see guys just doing like wind sprints like a couple days before the race, like faster than they've run all year, just down a lead drive. Like there is just cost there. There's nothing but cost. Yeah, certainly shouldn't be adding new intensities and raising the volume of intensity a week out of your race. That's only going to hurt you.
Yeah, there's spinning the legs, and then there's just being silly, isn't there? And
Yeah.
yeah, adding more cost. I guess to wrap us up, Brad, without spoiling the book, I mean, you've given a really good tip there, kind of a key takeaway around sometimes using races, A, B, and C goals to help with your training. But any kind of big tips from the model itself that could potentially help our audience? Like, what would be the takeaways that they could potentially utilize with their training? We've touched on a few things around cost and control and intensity. But yeah, apart from going and buying the book, is there anything else that you would give them as a little bit of advice?
Yeah, I think that at its core, that control is the juice of the method, and maybe learning to researching this book and writing, and evolving my own training throughout that process has just kind of happened naturally. I certainly became more conscious of control, and maybe having a bit more hubris, and not letting the ego get in the way of a workout, of ruining the following day's workouts or the following weeks. And yeah, just think about if people get anything out of this book, I hope it's just a way of reframing the way they look at their training, and maybe doing so in a way that uh, yeah, you can really don't be afraid to ease off a little bit and let your ego rest if it means you can ultimately get in more volume, because that is going to make you a better athlete. And yeah, it's great to. I love that we talked about like the B and C races because those are great to have. But like the biggest goals, just those should be as long term as possible. And just because you signed up for a marathon or an Ironman in 4 months, if the training isn't going according to plan and you're not going to hit those numbers, focus on the bigger picture and the broader stuff because like we said about the great Norwegian athletes, the goal is just to keep on going steady and steady and steady up and not plateau and certainly not hurt yourself and go down. So yeah, that's a very long-winded and circuitous summary, but yeah, I hope that's what some people can take away from it.
No, I love it. It's yeah, it's a really good way of putting it with the, I guess, yeah, not just well, my wife describes it as leave the ego at the door. Don't just let the ego get in the way of everything that you do.
Mm.
If you can often leave it at the door and don't get dragged into what other people are doing. If they're training hard, stick to what you believe in. But ultimately, like, start to understand those zones. We use a very simple method. We use RPE a lot, 1 to 10. And if I was prescribing some tempo or threshold work, it's around 7, 8. And people often say to me, "What is 7, 8?" Like, get to know what that is. Learn over time because sometimes it's the best way. And if you don't have a lactate monitor, RPE is still proven to be a very, very accurate measure once you get the feel of it. But I would say, and this is an advice from my previous coach, probably the best I've ever had, was that zone is so big, it's better to be a little bit slower than it is faster.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and yeah, understanding that there's so much focus on zones, but yeah, also understanding that it is a very broad distribution, and yeah, that uh, yeah, definitely. If you're going to err on the lower side of that slope for sure.
Yeah, whereas people usually look, if you give people a pace range, particularly runners, you say, oh, go out and run 6:30 to 6:10 miling, and they'll always be at 6:10.
Yep.
It's like because they're trying to impress the coach often, but the impressive thing here is the control element, isn't it? And sometimes
Yeah.
that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, and I love yeah, your wife's expression, leave the ego at the door. The two most prominent Norwegian athletes and characters in this book are routinely labeled as being very egotistical, especially Jakob. But I think that the one thing that they do extraordinarily well with their training is that there is no ego in their training. There is,
Interesting.
there's listening, sticking to the program, knowing what works, and yeah, just let the competition get carried away. And yeah, they do a very, very good job of leaving that ego at the door when they step out.
Yeah, so that's a really nice place to end it. Yeah, because people think Jakob's cocky and he has this big ego, but yeah, it's very much controlled in a training setting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and then comes out to play on race day maybe, which is why maybe he's so successful. And same
Yeah.
as Christian.
And
Yeah.
so much fun to follow as well. And I think adds a lot to the sport.
Yeah, and things like him and Josh and the battles, and yeah, everyone was talking about it down the track this year with Josh Kerr, Jakob Ingebrigtsen, the big trade off, and then neither of them get there. Cole Hocker
Yeah.
sprint up the inside. It was just, yeah, it was a really great moment, and that all comes from building personalities and things as well, which adds hype to the sport, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think that
brilliant.
I'm excited to see tracks. I didn't think I would ever say this, but track seems to be in a pretty good place right now.
Mm.
Especially, Grand Slam coming on and yeah, just the right athletes. And so, yeah, track is I'm foreign to the track world because I'm, swimming and triathlon. I've just kind of become more of a fan than anything else. But I've loved observing it and how weird and messed up it is. And it seems like it might be being steered in the right direction, maybe. But who knows?
Yeah, I agree. I agree, and I've certainly kind of the last couple of years fell out of love with it a little bit, and then all of a sudden it just seems to be hitting a bit of a sweet spot again, which is great. So
Yeah,
yeah,
good to hear.
excellent. Well, thanks, Brad. That's been so insightful, and yeah, I know a lot of people will have enjoyed that. They'll take a lot from it, and yeah, I really can't recommend the book strongly enough. I think it's a brilliant read. I got through it in like a week. And my wife said straight away, she said, "Oh, I've done well with that Christmas present, haven't I?" And yeah, she really did. So thanks to her for buying that, but thanks to you for getting it out there to the wider public. Amazon, is that the best place for them to get it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, especially if you're in Europe or in the UK, Amazon's easiest. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. It's a fun chat, and yeah, definitely stay in touch.
Yeah, will do. And thanks very much again for your time. It is really appreciated. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of people will take a lot from this conversation. So yeah, thanks very much, Brad.
Thank you, Lewis.
Cheers, buddy.